Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr and Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com.
I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. The Tennessee State Legislature recently wrapped up the first session of the 114th General Assembly. On yesterday's show, reporters assigned to cover the work of our elected state representatives joined us to recap bills passed, bills still waiting to be signed by the governor, and bills that didn't pass but might make an appearance again next year. You can catch up on yesterday's episode through our podcast feed. Today, we want to go a bit deeper on the issues with a post-session analysis. How will the legislation passed on issues like education, immigration, and foster care impact the lives of the people who live and work in the state? Plus, it's your turn to talk, and we are opening up the phone lines. What comments or questions do you have about this year's assembly? Call 615-760-2000 to join the conversation. Before we get started, just a quick disclosure. In a previous career, I worked as a political operative and organizer. So joining us today are Cameron Smith, opinion columnist and member of the editorial board for The Tennessean, Bruce Barry, Vanderbilt professor and opinion columnist for Tennessee Lookout, and Dawn Sluckabeer, advocacy and government relations director for Think Tennessee. Welcome to This is Nashville.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
So let's go ahead and dive in, Dawn. Several years ago, Think Tennessee started publishing a State of Our State dashboard to help Tennesseans learn more about policy outcomes in the state. The 2025 updated version includes a list of, quote, 15 metrics that matter most for Tennesseans' economic mobility. And one of those is education. So how are we doing?
Yeah, so the State of Our State dashboard is a great tool to answer those types of questions. And just a quick sort of framing of it, we take a look at the dashboard shows sort of the ranking, or rather the value for Tennessee, how Tennessee is doing in, say, a measure of educational assessment, compares that nationally across other states and compares it to the national average. And so we're using data sources that have all of that information. And so I'll share a couple of stats and answer that question, but I just will clarify that there's a couple of different years that this data is coming from. And I'll throw that out there just for folks who are interested. So short answer is we are doing ahead of the pack in some places and trailing some states in other places. So in terms of educational assessment, we have fewer students than the national average scoring below proficient in math and reading at the 8th grade level and for 4th grade math, but more students scoring below proficient in 4th grade reading. So kind of a little bit at the front of the pack and then a little bit behind the pack. So in 4th grade, we're 36th with a ranking of 1 being the top and 50 or 51 being the bottom. So 36th in reading proficiency for 4th grade, but then 16th for math proficiency, and then 16th and 18th for 8th grade proficiency. So pretty good on those metrics. Those percentages change a little bit when you disaggregate by race or ethnicity. We're 33rd in 8th grade math proficiency among Hispanic or Latino students, with 87% scoring below proficient in math achievement levels. So a little bit of a variation once you disaggregate that a little bit further. We do have a higher graduation rate than the national average when we're looking at 2021 data. So that's a spot where we rank second in the country, with 90.4% of public high school students graduating within 4 years compared to 85.7% as the national average.
When would we expect additional data? That's from 2021.
That's from 2021.
When would we expect updated data on that?
That is also a very good question. So we just updated this dashboard this year, a couple months ago. So we are anxiously anticipating an update of that data. It should be anytime soon, but 2021 was the most recent, so we would anticipate it hopefully sometime soon. We do have Tennessee data for more current years, but not the full country, so we can't do that same comparison.
Does the research say anything about vouchers?
Our data dashboard doesn't include anything specifically on vouchers, but we're looking at sort of the impacts, on educational assessment. We've got public school teacher salaries and ratios, but nothing particularly about the impact of vouchers specifically.
Well, they say timing is everything. And this morning, the results of Vanderbilt University's spring 2025 statewide poll were released. So we're going to pepper in some results during this discussion. What's interesting about the Vanderbilt poll is that it's conducted among registered voters, which means that unless specified, the results are the views of participants, regardless of whether they actually voted or not. Vanderbilt pollsters do note that some results change when they report results for those who say they voted in the 2024 presidential election. On vouchers, these poll results show that, quote, only 8% of parents with public school children say they plan to use the vouchers to move their child to a private school. 34% of parents of private school students say they plan to apply for a voucher to help tuition, while 45% say they don't plan on applying at all. Cameron, what are your thoughts about vouchers?
So it's interesting that the discussion with vouchers often operates in a vacuum. That's it. Vouchers, good or bad. My take on this, and where I've been for quite some time, is vouchers are insufficient to deal with the issue of education in a state like Tennessee. It's great to hear that our graduation rate is around 90%. That sounds like a good figure, but when you look at per the state's own achievement report card, the achievement rate is 39.6%. So when you pair the numbers together, basically we are graduating a lot of students that don't have basic competency in core subject matters. That means the system is broken. And so I am supportive of any measure that will give any opportunity to folks to find educational alternatives. Frankly, I want to see much more flexibility for the public school system, but by our own measures, we're failing. And it's hard to make sweeping statements like that based on an aggregation of data. But when you start to break it out along socioeconomic lines, along racial lines, an interesting fact, the only racial cohort in Tennessee where more than half of the students were at the achievement rate, that means they were proficient or above, was Asian Tennesseans. That's it. Every other racial cohort that we tracked was, to put it mildly, underwater. When you look at Black students, for example, the achievement rate drops materially. And that's not because of race. It's because education isn't equal across the board. Schools aren't equal across the board. And we really need to look at this and say, is this one size fits all public system working? I think the answer is self-evidently no. And so vouchers are a option, but it's not enough. And we really need to figure out a comprehensive game plan here to overhaul public education, because it just doesn't work right now.
Bruce?
Well, Cameron and I agree that the system is in some ways failing, and that vouchers are not the solution to that. I take issue with the idea that, well, we have a lot of problems and anything we can throw at it that might give parents another choice is worth giving a try to. And as an abstract statement, you could almost sort of say that makes sense. But when you actually look at the specifics of the specific voucher plan that the governor proposed and the legislature passed in this session, it's such a drop in the bucket. I mean, this is a program that will provide vouchers for 20,000 students. As you observed when you were summarizing some of the data, Mary, the very few public school parents want to use these vouchers to move their kids to private school. This is mostly to basically subsidize private school tuition already being paid by private school parents. And the income limits, which apply to only half the vouchers, aren't that low. And basically wealthy people sending their kids to expensive private schools can get these vouchers and have the rest of us fund their private education, which is just an absurd way to tackle the problems that Dawn and Cameron both so well articulate. Mm-hmm. And it's just a massive distraction. And by the way, the data shows that vouchers from other states don't really actually achieve the improved achievement outcomes that many hope that it would. Yeah. I'm cynical.
Yeah. Well, Tennessee recently hit pause on a bill that would have allowed public schools to turn away undocumented kids or charge them tuition. Bruce, do you think all children who are here have a right to attend public schools?
Well, they do under present law. this is an interesting question around this bill around, do you penalize children for the immigration choices made by their parents that put them in a situation where they could go to school or not go to school? If you were starting a country from scratch and you had no immigrants at all, and then you said, well, you know what, people who come here, you're only going to be entitled to education if you're here legally. I suppose you could implement a rule like that. But, you have to govern the country that you have. And we have a country with 11, 12 million people who are not, in a sense, documented in a way that might be negatively affected if all states had a rule like this. Yeah, the other thing I want to say about the legislature's attempt to, and they didn't, of course, actually pass the bill, but it may come back next year, their attempt to allow school systems to exclude undocumented immigrant children or to charge them tuition it's blatantly unconstitutional by, of course, a Supreme Court decision from the 1980s called Plyler v. Doe. And this is really a bill that's not even about immigrants and it's not about costs. It's about teeing up a challenge that perhaps their the Tennessee GOP's ideological overlords at the national level wishes that the legislature would tee up. And so this thing may be back because that's what they're really after.
Yeah, Cameron, do you see this as a genuine policy debate or do you see it more of a political strategy to provoke a legal challenge? What are your thoughts? Do children who are here have a right to attend public schools? Cameron?
So I think the real issue here, sorry, I was briefly muted, is for me is one of enforcement. So let's just assume for a minute that the legal challenges were survived if this thing became law. How exactly do we want to enforce that? Are we going to turn our public educational institutions into law enforcement agencies? This is one of the challenges with, we've done similar things in the business space of saying, well, if you can prevent folks without legal status from having employment opportunities, then you can somehow manage immigration that way. I think these are all pointing to the same thing, that is we need to start enforcing our existing immigration laws. We are doing that now. And I think it's fair to argue we have not done that well. There are significant ramifications for starting to do that now, but I don't think we can effectively address immigration policy in a vacuum. I think it's it's not really a political thing for me because it's a policy thing either way of the legal challenge or the policy. I think it's a fair question to say, should people who are here without legal status be entitled to public benefits? I do think there are certain things that they should be entitled to, like due process rights, for example. But when it comes to public benefits and things like that, to revisit that question as a matter of this potentially Supreme Court, I think is a fair ask, because it's very reasonable to say we are trying to use a finite amount of resources to educate people here in our state. If there are people who should not be here and are not here with legal status, should we be forced to use the resources to educate them too? And I think the answer is probably no.
Bruce?
Well, that's kind of why I threw out my sort of if you were starting a country from scratch hypothetical, because that is the question about public benefits that Cameron raises, I think is a very, it's an interesting question of political philosophy and ethics as well. What I wanted to say about this, though, is, on the point that Cameron, I think, rightfully asked, do we want our school systems to be enforcement agencies? One of the interesting things about this bill, and maybe one of the reasons why it didn't pass this session and is going to be carried over, is because the House and Senate versions differed. The Senate version requires public school systems to check the immigration status of children to essentially become that enforcement agent. The House bill would have merely made it optional. Like, if you want to do this, you can. If you want to check, you can. If you want to charge tuition for undocumented immigrant children, you can. But you don't have to. Sort of reminds me of the arming teachers. Wasn't that sort of at the discretion of school systems? Very few wanted to do it. And I predict that if the legislature next year maybe does pass the optional version of this, that we'll again find very few local school systems really wanting to get involved in this precisely because they don't want to be enforcement authorities. They want to educate children.
All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will continue our discussion with Cameron Smith, Bruce Barry, and Dawn Sluckabeer. Stay with us.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Nobody Trashes Tennessee, the state of Tennessee's official litter prevention campaign, managed by TDOT. Details on how to be part of the solution to end littering at nobodytrashestennessee.com. Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP, and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. Today we're analyzing the Tennessee State Legislative Session, which wrapped up at the end of April. Joining us to continue the conversation are Bruce Barry, opinion columnist for the Tennessee Lookout, Cameron Smith, opinion columnist for the Tennessean, and Dawn Sluckabeer, advocacy and government relations director for Think Tennessee. Plus, the phone lines are open. What questions or comments do you have about the legislation passed this year? Call 615-760-2000 to join the conversation. Cynthia, you've been so patient. We're going to go to you. Cynthia from Smyrna, Tennessee. What's on your mind?
Yes. There are two bills that I was disappointed that passed. One was on the isolated wetlands. To me, I don't like the bill anyway because the wetlands reduce the risk of flooding and they filter the water so local utilities don't have to spend as much and we can possibly get better quality water because of them. But also they oppose Governor Lee since many of those wetlands feed into the Duck eventually, and if they're not protected, then it's going to harm the Duck River further. The other bill that really irritated me was using the voucher bill. And if we've got, based on the 20,000 the ability to issue 20,000 vouchers at $7,500 a pop, that's $150 million that could be spent to improve education for all students, including those who are not documented, and improve the schools, bring in consultants who can help schools to improve their curriculum, to improve their social environment so that we have better education for all students. Because the other thing is, even with the vouchers, not all parents who would want to send their kids to private school would be able to because of location of private schools or ability to transport them to private schools.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
And the vouchers are only going to increase my tax dollars that are needed per student for public education because the building costs don't go down when you take a few students out of it. The administrative costs for the school board, for the principals, for the janitors, et cetera, don't go down. And those are all considered as part of the cost per student. So we can't just do it based on cost per student and have it be the same funding for the school. We're hurting ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. Going back to the wetlands bill, that bill has not been signed by the governor yet, so it is sitting on his desk.
I know. I hope he won't sign it. I told him to veto it. But
Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks so much for calling.
Can I make a fast comment on the wetlands bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can't claim to be an expert on the technical aspects of wetlands, and Cynthia articulated some of that, I think, nicely. But a thing about a bill like that, it's really about regulation, environmental regulation. And when you look at the bill and how it has played out in the legislature, you're talking about marshaling the massive lobbying forces of the Tennessee Chamber, which supported this bill, the building association of people who want to build things, and that that argument really tends to win the day, especially in a legislature like ours, which is dominated by, the majority party that is very sympathetic to those business interests. And so that's how you end up with what is clearly a travesty to be deregulating wetlands at the very massive level that they're doing so in this bill. I share Cynthia's view that I would love to see the governor veto it, although that will just be overridden, I'm sure.
Well, a foster care youth bill of rights was unanimously passed by Tennessee lawmakers and signed into law by the governor. Specifically, it guarantees all kids in foster care access to an education, medical care, and a safe environment free from abuse, neglect, and pests. The bill also ensures that foster kids can report abuse without fear of punishment. Now, Cameron, you're a therapeutic foster parent, and as you know, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services has been under scrutiny for decades. Is this bill in any way going to help address the issues with DCS?
Let me think of no. I just say no. It is a feel-good piece of legislation. But you'll forgive me for being suspicious about government guarantees. In a vacuum, it sounds good. I mean, the guarantees of health care and dental care and environments free from retaliation, all of these things sound excellent. And so in that sense, I don't argue with it, but that guarantee is only as good as that guarantee is enforced. And what I've seen right now is the abject failure of the state of Tennessee to care for some of the most vulnerable people in the state. We have said it is a problem. We have identified the problem. We've said we're working on the problem. But I'll just give you an anecdotal story. One of my sons has had 6 different DCS caseworkers in a year because of the level of turnover that they experience. When we look at the resource availability and helping these kids process through trauma with techniques and science-based resources that we know can help, the state is woefully inadequate in, frankly, taking care of these kids and even recruiting people to help in the effort. I don't believe that this is solely a government requirement to figure out what to do with wards of the state, the foster care system, even adoption. This is a thing for the volunteer state, for our communities to say, this is not something that we should be okay with. We should not be okay with kids sleeping in state office buildings for any amount of time. And there's some great ministries that are trying to engage, but without a more robust conversation, without better advocacy from our leaders for a constituency that, frankly, nobody can make a lot of money off of. So there's not a lot of bold voices. We are doing a radical disservice to children who, particularly for my conservative brethren, one of the worst things I can imagine is for the state to be your parent. And we need to be there for these kids. We need to show up. We need to help. We don't need government guarantees. We need to be the hands and feet of a community that wants to take care of folks. And we're just falling really, really short on a number of fronts. I'm glad that we say we want to guarantee some stuff. I wouldn't take that guarantee to the bank.
Are there any productive next steps? You mentioned, some data out there. What could be done to improve Department of Children's Services? What have you read?
So I think the first thing is transparency. And I know that's a broad word, but one of the things that when it comes to particularly minors, it's the idea of privacy, and we want to make sure that we protect the kids' privacy. Totally understand that. But that can't be a shield for bad behavior. When there are things that are not clear about what the agency is doing, why it's doing it, what the overall game plan is, how are these facilities that the state directly and indirectly manages, what's the oversight there? And when we know there are problems, when we know there are challenges, the easy thing is to say, well, there's always going to be unfortunate circumstances, and we can't fix everything. okay, well, let's not start by saying we got to fix it all. Let's do the little things. TennCare, for example, with foster kids, denies tons and tons of requests for braces. And essentially, if you don't have a severe defect in your mouth, then it's very, very hard to get braces. And you know what? For a teenager who's been moved from home to home, one of the toughest things is you're already going to have challenges. It might as well be nice to be able to smile and have a straight smile. And those are little things where we could say, okay, is anybody against telling TennCare that for kids that are in the foster system at the age where they need braces, we don't just do this for medical need. If they want braces to straighten their teeth, we should do it. I've talked to orthodontists around the state saying, well, it's kind of interesting that we don't really help. And hopefully in the coming months, I'll be able to work on something where we can maybe have a public-private partnership type thing to get some of this going. But I mean, we have a company like FedEx in Memphis that can track packages all over the globe. We can't even track kids in our own state. And we probably need to figure some of this stuff out.
Bruce?
Well, I mean, Cameron, you describe what's going on with a lot of obviously personal knowledge and it's very compelling examples. What concerns me is that we're talking about essentially what you're describing is government not doing its job, government not operating in the public interest the way it should. And although, yes, you can do public-private partnerships and maybe privatize certain things, what I worry about is that, and I'm going to paint with a little bit of a broad brush here, that an awful lot of contemporary American conservatism is so distrustful of government's ability to do things that it doesn't actually have a vested interest in getting it to do things better. When we have a Republican conservative controlled legislature, Cameron asks, why can't they do these simple things like FedEx can do? And I sometimes think it's because they actually don't want to. They actually don't really have an interest in making government work better because their political careers are invested in the idea that government works badly. And this issue seems like the kind of very sad and unfortunate kind of side effect of that ideology.
Well, radically.
Yeah,
go ahead, Cameron.
Bruce, I'll respond briefly to that. I think that's correct in some respects. I think that conservatives, for example, pro-life conservatives, can't be pro-birth conservatives. We need to realize that life is precious at every stage, and we need to realize that we need answers. Now, those answers don't have to be, we need bigger government, we need more government, but they do have to be answers. And I think the argument is it's very fair to say, if conservatives don't want government to do it, that's not the end of the discussion. I think a moral and just people must say, if I don't want government to do all of these things, then we must do these things. And we must figure out how to do that. Public-private partnership, fine. But at the end of the day, it's all the same. We're all the same people. And so we must figure out how we will care for the most vulnerable in our state. And if we don't do that, that's a moral failure of all of us, not just of government or the private sector.
I agree.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Mary Mancini. We're talking this hour with Bruce Barry, Dawn Sluckabeer, and Cameron Smith. And the phone lines are open. If you have any questions or comments about the state legislative session, give us a call at 615-760-2000. That's 615-760-2000. Radically changing topics now. Bruce, as you reminded us in a column you wrote recently, we're one of the few states where it's still totally illegal to grow, sell, or even have marijuana, even for medical use. You can face criminal charges if you do. But at the same time, people in Tennessee can walk into a store and legally buy all kinds of cannabis products that definitely have psychological effects. How did we get here, and what are these products?
Well, the major change that occurred was when the federal government in 2018 in the Farm Bill basically decriminalized hemp. Hemp defined as a marijuana plant, a cannabis plant that has less than a certain low percentage of THC, the active intoxicating ingredient in pot. If it's below 0.3%, this very small threshold, it's hemp. It's not marijuana. And what the federal government did in that farm bill was it made that hemp no longer a scheduled drug. And so therefore hemp is legal everywhere. You can grow it. You can stuff it up your nose. You can do whatever you want with a hemp plant.
For decades, people said hemp is not marijuana.
Right. And the level of THC is so low that hemp plants are not by themselves particularly intoxicating. You could grind it up and roll it into a joint and you wouldn't get particularly stoned from it. But what the enterprising cannabis industry has figured out how to do is how to extract and purify the THC, albeit in low levels, from those hemp plants, which are legal, and then combine enough of it and then repackage it or, basically insert it into other consumables that could be gummies, the edibles that people eat. It could be beverages. It could be other things, and sell those. And as long as the by weight percentage of the active ingredient THC in the delivery vehicle, in the gummy, in the beverage, in the whatever, is below that low threshold, and as long as where that THC came from was a hemp plant, it's legal. So you can go to smoke shops all around the state and you can buy intoxicating products. And there's more complications to it than that. But that's what the legislature this year decided it needed to rein in with some regulation. We can talk about what it did if you want.
Well, but 2 years ago, 2 years ago, there was a bipartisan bill to regulate the hemp industry. So there was already some rules for licensing, testing, labeling, taxing.
Yep.
This new bill was to address, quote, unregulated recreational pot.
Yeah, basically the entrepreneurs who were creating cannabis-related businesses figured out ways to get around that prior bill, meaning to produce legal products, legal intoxicating products, and sell them in shops that were not particularly regulated by that prior bill. And so this, in part, was an attempt to come back and say, okay, we're now going to specify a little more closely the percentages. We're going to take this one substance, THCA, which is a big component of hemp plant leaves, and we're going to try and exclude that entirely. And then another big thing this bill did, which has nothing to do with the content of the substances, is the bill, a big deal of this bill is to say, let's take all of the enforcement of all of this stuff having to do with hemp and pot and put it over into the ABC State Department, the Alcohol Beverage Control Department, rather than the Agriculture Department, where it had been.
Any indication of how this might affect the businesses that exist?
Well, that's tricky to figure out. I think what's clearly going to happen is it is going to make some of the products that they retail in shops to people no longer retailable. Some of the leaf sorts of plants that contain THCA. THCA is a substance in hemp that doesn't have a psychological effect. It's not an intoxicant until it's lit and burned, and then it becomes regular THC and you get high. The bill is going to make it harder for these retailers to sell that stuff, but I don't think it's going to necessarily cause them to halt a lot of these other edibles and other tinctures and edibles and other sorts of products. I don't think it's going to put them out of business, but it's going to change how they do business.
Don, let's take a look at maternal health in the state. Tennessee usually ranks among the top 5 states with the highest maternal mortality rates, but there have been some improvements. What does the Think Tennessee research show?
Yeah, so policies impacting health access and outcomes have measurable impacts on Tennesseans. And you're right, reports have consistently shown that Tennessee ranks among the worst in the country for maternal mortality and health. And it's a particular challenge in rural areas. So the dashboard health indicators show that Tennessee is trailing the national average on some additional key measures. We have higher rates than the national average on infant mortality, with 6.6 deaths per 1,000 live births versus 5.8. It's a ranking of 36th. We have higher rates than the national average on low birth weight, on teen birth rate, adults in fair or poor health, and then higher uninsured rates both generally and for children. So this is an area where Tennessee is trailing behind the national average and behind most of the rest of the country.
Did we see any legislation passed this year to address this?
So this is a little bit outside of our particular focus, but there were a handful of health-related health bills, legal protection for IVF and birth control being, I think, the biggest among them. But I would defer to the other experts in the room.
Well, the IVF and birth control bill that you mentioned is really an important bill. It's, I suppose Cameron might fairly say it's another feel-good bill because it defines a right that sort of already exists, or it's defining a right to access to birth control and a right to access to IVF treatments where there are no laws that deny that access. But the wording of the bill does suggest that a kind of a very firm statement of support for this as something that should override other laws potentially. And I should add that bill was passed with bipartisan support. Obviously, it would have to be.
Yeah.
But that's pretty important. We were hearing last year just in the national kind of conversation around whether some states, especially perhaps some conservative states, were interested in trying to use the law to somehow constrain the availability of fertility procedures like IVF. And one, I guess, nice thing about this bill is it makes a clear statement, at least for now, that Tennessee's not going to be such a state. You have a bipartisan legislature saying, no, these procedures are fine.
All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will continue our discussion with Cameron Smith, Bruce Barry, and Dawn Sluckerbeer. Stay with us. I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. This afternoon, we're analyzing the Tennessee State Legislative Session, which wrapped up at the end of July. Joining us are Dawn Sluckerbeer from Think Tennessee, Advocacy and Government Relations Director from Think Tennessee, Bruce Barry, columnist for A Tennessee Lookout, and Cameron Smith, columnist for The Tennessean. And the phone lines are open. What questions or comments do you have about this year's legislation? Call us at 615-760-2000 to join the conversation. That number again is 615-760-2000. There's another bill that's actually waiting on the governor's desk for his signature. It's the Protecting Everyone Against Crime and Extremism Act, or the PEACE Act. And it increases penalties for offenses like littering and trespassing if they infringe upon someone's, quote, right or privilege secured by the Constitution or laws of the United States or the Constitution or laws of the state of Tennessee. And this is specifically to address the some of the littering that happened when we had some white power Nazi sympathizers coming through and dropping off leaflets in different neighborhoods. Cameron, in a recent column, you wrote that you spoke to the sponsor of the bill, Republican William Lamberth. What did he tell you about his motives for introducing the legislation?
Well, his motives were excellent. It was, I don't want anybody to be intimidated by hate groups or other folks that would come around and essentially release propaganda that was designed to make other people feel like, they couldn't speak freely. They couldn't take positions that they wanted to take. My exception with the PEACE Act, as it was initially formulated, was twofold. One, I did not have a clear answer from the sponsors as to if littering is a crime and the speech is the aggravating circumstance to this new level of crime, how is it not the speech content that's effectively being curtailed and regulated? And I think there's constitutional concerns with that. If the government is regulating the content of speech there, I think we have a problem. It didn't seem like there was any specific time, place, and manner restriction around it other than, hey, what does this thing say? And so as a columnist and somebody who's an aggressive defender of speech, that concerned me. There was also a measure in the bill that, in the version that's on the governor's desk, has been improved. It started out saying that law enforcement had the ability to essentially on demand create a 25-foot buffer from themselves. And I raised concerns with the sponsors and said, that's not okay. A police officer does need the ability to do their job, but to simply say, I can now move the public around on demand because I want to, again, I think runs afoul of things that we care about deeply, like freedoms of assembly, freedoms of speech. And so that's been changed. So it's effectuating a lawful arrest, and it lists some specific criteria there. I think that's improved. Again, this all seems to me to be a little bit of a symptom of the legislature in Tennessee has done a lot of things over the last several years that were sort of their signature marquee pieces of legislation. And I think right now they're trying to figure out, well, people elected us to legislate. What if we don't have a full, robust agenda because things are actually going pretty well? And I think the answer has to be, well, then don't do it. Now, have hearings, conduct oversight, look at the performance of the government. Don't feel like you need to create more laws just to do it.
I agree with that last sentiment that Cameron expressed. This bill, the Peace Act, does strike me to sort of throw it into 5 words as, a lawsuit waiting to happen on a number of its provisions for precisely the reasons Cameron was talking about. I think there are some real free speech concerns here. It's a case where they decided to legislate some tactics that unsavory groups use to communicate unsavory messages. So therefore, let's try to legislate those tactics away. And that creates First Amendment problems. But I did want to comment quickly on where Cameron ended up there. The idea that they think things are going pretty well here. Well, okay, we can all, we can have a different argument about that, I guess. But so they come up with things to legislate about. What concerns me, and if you think about the topics we've been talking about for the 45 minutes we've been having this conversation, we find increasingly the legislature legislating against documentable public interest. I mean, people in Tennessee are quite cynical about vouchers. People in Tennessee want legal pot, for crying out loud, as opposed to these complicated changing regulatory schemes. We're not talking today here about gun laws, but that's another issue where the clear desire of the people conflicts with what the legislature does. And I'm guessing if we could poll on this Peace Act, we would find most people think it's pretty dopey too. So it's not just that they're finding things to legislate because they can't think of anything else to do, but it's that they're specifically finding things that the public probably really wouldn't want them to legislate.
Cameron, what do you think?
Well, I think the electoral results would beg to differ. That, yes, we can look at polling, and the Vanderbilt polling, for example, if you ask folks if they want to cut Medicare, you do find bipartisan agreement. The answer is no. When you parse the questions in very specific ways, you get predictable answers. When I look at the makeup of the legislature, I hear this time and again, particularly from my friends who are of a more liberal persuasion. Well, the legislature is acting against the interest of the public. Well, the public has a recourse for that. It's an electoral one. And they've clearly shown, and it was sort of buried in the Vanderbilt poll, but towards the end, if you look at folks that report voting, the results are markedly improved for Republicans. Well, yeah. And I think that, to me, tells us a little bit more of the story. If folks look at this and say, we don't like the way it's going, they should vote for somebody else. There's nothing wrong with that. I think what we have to realize is we need to stop solving mythical problems. That's an issue across the board. For example, the issue with marijuana in Tennessee. I will have 4 boys in high school next year. I can tell you right now, the vapor products that are available to these kids are wild. They can put anything in a cartridge. The issue that I would say is the reality is the cat's out of the bag on a topic like that. We should acknowledge reality and say, okay, we need to address this. Keep this stuff out of the hands of minors, out of kids. Be real strident on vape stores and folks like that to make sure that they're checking identification. But for consenting adults who say, you know what, I want to get high, can you just tell me what's in this thing? Okay, we allow the sale of intoxicating liquors, and yet we do this weird dance where we just fail to acknowledge reality. And if I don't want to get high, I don't have to. That's part of liberty. And so I think our conservative population really needs to own up to its own values and say, hey, the market can put products out there, and we can say, here's the area that we don't want it. We don't want it for kids. But otherwise, let's not have really expensive regulatory regimes on this stuff. Let's not have stuff that's clearly not aligned with where most folks are, and not even what you can go down the road and purchase. So until we start doing that, we're going to do some of these silly pieces of legislation, silly regulatory paradigms. We need to start acting on reality as opposed to hypothetical politics.
Well, we touched on elections just a little bit in there, but let's also, Dawn, turn to you. The State of the State dashboard included in the summary of Tennessee's lowest rankings that we are 47th in voter turnout in presidential elections. Is voter turnout something that can be addressed by legislative policies?
Yes. So that is something that we spend a lot of time looking at, voter turnout rates and the policies that other states implement that are not implemented here in Tennessee. So different policies like the voter registration deadline, who is eligible and how you are able to cast absentee ballots if you aren't able to make it to the polls on Election Day. So there are different types of policies sort of throughout the whole voting spectrum that could have an impact on both getting more people registered and then also to the polls.
And were any bills passed this year that would encourage voter participation?
So there were two voting bills that passed that I think could encourage voting participation. I think the bulk of the election bills that were filed this year sort of took a little bit of a backward step that seemed to be cracking down a little bit more, further restrictions on voter ID, increasing the absentee eligibility age from 60, which is currently, to 65, and a couple of proving citizenship while you're registering to vote. So those were proposals that were introduced but didn't get discussed or passed this year. There were two bills, though, that I mentioned. There's a bill that allows Hamblin County to become the 10th county to implement vote center pilot projects. So this would be a way. In Davidson County, for example, on Election Day, you have to go to your assigned polling place if you're voting on Election Day. With a county that has vote centers, so say Rutherford County or Wilson County or in future Hamblin County, on Election Day, you could go to any vote center site in the county. And so this it increases access for folks who are maybe working outside of the county and don't have time to get to that specific poll. They can go to any location in their county.
Quick question before you go to the next one, and then Bruce, does that replace any polling locations, those vote centers, or are they in addition to?
It is. It likely replaces them. And so I think in Rutherford County, you have more individual polling sites when you have them assigned, and spread out throughout the county. When you move to the vote center model, when you're having fewer actual polling places, but they are larger. So it will likely remove some of those church polling places on the corner that you can walk to from your house, but it increases access in the sense that you have more options to choose from rather than just that particular one.
I just wanted to make the point that, as you listen to Dawn recite these various different measures that have been introduced or could have been introduced or other states have them, I think the bottom line that's really clear is that if you had a legislature, a state government that actually just at a very basic level wants more people rather than fewer people to vote, there are a number of buttons that can be easily pushed to do so. And the fact that there's such reluctance in the Tennessee legislature to do a lot of those things is so frustrating. And we do have to throw in one other word on this subject, and that word is gerrymandering, which affects Cameron's point about the power of the voters to change the direction of state government in the face of gerrymandering.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to thank our guests, Dawn Sluckabeer, Advocacy and Government Relations Director for Think Tennessee, Bruce Barry, Vanderbilt professor and opinion columnist for Tennessee Lookout, and Cameron Smith, opinion columnist and member of the editorial board for The Tennessean. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And if you'd like to catch up on any This Is Nashville episodes you've missed, all episodes are on our podcast or through our podcast feed. You'll find almost every episode there. And thank you so much for tuning in this hour. This Is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by me. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Producer Josh Deepin was on the phones. Our board operator is Liv Lombardi, and the masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get podcasts. The conversation doesn't end here. You can comment and tell us what you want to hear on the show by leaving us a message at 615-751-2500. This is Nashville. I'm Mary Mancini. We'll see you on Monday, everybody, and thanks so much for listening.